There are forces that are against the arising of the church in this season. And such of that force is actually a power. It's called fear. So there's always a contrary expression of life that is in us that should live above the current darkness of our time. So darkness here represents many things, but in the context of our teaching this morning, it represents confusion. So when there's darkness, there is confusion. It represents distress amongst nations. The nations are in distress as I speak. It represents perplexity. It represents blindness and separation from the ordained life that God has prescribed for man. So there is a life that God has prescribed for man. And when there is darkness, darkness separates us from understanding and gaining access to that kind of life. So understand that the operation of the current coronavirus is actually more satanic than demonic. Not because the disease itself is powerful. Listen, cancer is more powerful than, is more evil, it's more deadlier, thank you, than coronavirus. Lassa fever is more deadlier. Even Ebola. So, but you know, but there's just something about this virus and fear. So you understand that the operation is not demonic. It's satanic. What do spirits do? They bring fear on massive scale over nations. So when you look at news, the only thing they are talking about today is what? Coronavirus. So when darkness is prevailing over, one of the way darkness reigns is by fear. And one of what fear pushes is actually death. When there is fear, fear empowers the reign of death. And when I'm talking about death, I'm not just talking about physical falling away of the body. I'm talking about separation from God's life. Death is also separation from God's thoughts. When you're in a particular circumstance, what is the first thought you think? Do you think what the world says or what God has said? Now, when we quickly respond, amen, when we respond first to the thoughts of the earth, the evil reports of the earth, that is an operation of death. You know, one of the things that I admired about the first century church when I did a little bit of research in my growing up years as a believer, one of the things I saw clearly about that church order is that one of the things is that they conquered the fear of death. They were not afraid of anything except the Lord. That was why in the midst of contrary circumstances, they did not deny him, even at the point of death. It means that something, they have overcome something. They have conquered the fear of death. So Jesus did not just take care of death, he conquered the fear of death. The fear of death is the power that brings men under the influence of a false life. What the fear of death does is to impose a life of servitude, a life of bondage, a life of limitation. Fear of death puts us under a limitation inside. So we are limited in our minds and we cannot see the power of God on the hope that God brings to us. Fear opens the door to anxiety. I hope you know that. Once you are afraid, you are anxious. Once you are afraid, you worry. You worry about everything. Of course, we know that fear is a negative force. Anytime you are afraid, you start getting worried and you start paying circumstances. Does it happen to you before? When you are afraid, you just begin to think about many things. Possible things that can happen. And then, the more you fear, the more those things you are thinking becomes what? Real. They become real to the point that they now put a kind of limitation upon your heart. At that time, you find it difficult to think, what exactly is God's thought concerning this situation? What is God's mind concerning this situation? What has God said? So you find yourself in the midst of a terrible situation. And the natural response is for you to follow suit. At that point, God has a prescribed standard. God has a prescribed thought. There is an expectation that God is expecting us to be able to see him in that situation. To see him means that I can understand that, okay, even though there is a prevailing circumstance around me, this is what God has said. So what God has said is stronger than what I am experiencing. I can actually believe God and hold on to the promises of his word. So fear actually is a kind of veil. It's a covering cast. You know, it brings men under bondage to Satan and ultimately death. So, ultimately physical death and then separation from God.